Hi, AP World History. This is Mr. Genocide with my last video about atrocities after 1900. And our final topic is the Rwandan Genocide. In 1994, members of the Hutu ethnic majority in Rwanda, a East Central African nation, I'll have a map of that later for you, murdered as many as 800,000 Tutsi minorities. It was started by Hutu nationalists, and one of the characteristics of this particular genocide was how rapidly violence spread throughout the nation once it became essentially sanctioned by the government. And we will tell that story in this lesson. By the time the Tutsi led Rwandese Patriotic Front, a type of rebel group, a type of military group that will function kind of outside the borders of Rwanda. And again, we will talk about the story of the Rwandese Patriotic Front. By the time they gained control, hundreds of thousands of Tutsis were dead, and it sparked a gigantic humanitarian crisis as there were up to 2 million displaced refugees throughout this particular part of Africa. So, there's a long history of ethnic tension within Rwanda between the Hutus and the Tutsis. By 1900s, Rwanda, it's a small country with a very dense population. 85% are Hutu, with the rest being Tutsi, and a small number of Pygmy in this nation. Now, with many of these African nations, they have a long history, of course, with European colonization. And from 1897 to 1918, Rwanda was part of German East Africa. After World War I, under a League of Nations mandate, Rwanda was transferred over to Belgian control. During this Belgian control, the Tutsis, the minority, were largely favored by the Belgian government and put a Tutsi monarch in place, of course, at the expense of the other 85% of the population. And so you have here one, there's already a history of ethnic tension, but to exacerbate that ethnic tension, you have a foreign European power putting their faith and power in a minority population which is already distrusted in Rwanda by the majority. Here's that map. Here's that picture of Rwanda, right? Small little country in Central East Africa. 1959, there's a Hutu revolution that forced up to 330,000 Tutsis to flee the country. 1961, victories forced the Tutsi monarch into exile. Sorry for the spelling mistake. Okay, but 1961, that Hutu revolution, which of course is a nationalistic movement, right? Hutu ethnic minority in charge, looking to form a nation that is more representative of them, sadly drawn by this nationalistic identity, forcing the Tutsis largely out of Rwanda, or at least a segment of Tutsis out of Rwanda, including the Tutsi monarch that was put in power by the Belgian government. In 1962, a United Nations referendum spurred Belgium to grant Rwanda its independence. However, of course, now by this time, we have several decades of resentment amongst the Hutu population against the Tutsis built up through this period of European colonization. Ethnic violence continued through this period of independence. In 1973, a military group put Major General Juvenal I'm gonna butcher this, Haba Aramana, who was a moderate Hutu, into power, and he brings a measure of control into Rwanda. Habyarimana is elected by the new Rwandan constitution, and he and his party and his government are in charge for the next 2 decades. In 1990, okay, that Rwandese Patriotic Front, consisting of Tutsi refugees who had been pushed out of the country up to 20 years prior, invade Rwanda from neighboring Uganda. Habyarimana blames Tutsis in Rwanda of being accomplices, and you see a government sponsored wave of violence from 1990 to 1993, where hundreds of Tutsis are killed by the now Hutu majority government. However, to try to end the violence and to bring another measure of peace to Rwanda, in 1993, Habyarimana, he signs an agreement that is brokered in Tanzania, in which he calls for the creation of a transition government that would include the Rwandese Patriotic Front, and in which case, right, Tutsis would then be representative in the Rwandan government, and you would try to bring some sort of measure of peace and representation between the two conflicting ethnic groups. However, Hutu extremists are not a fan of this idea of letting Tutsis into the government, and so they take swift, horrible action to prevent this new transition government in which both ethnic groups are represented from coming into power. On April 6, 1994, a plane carrying General Habyarimana and Burundi's president is shot down over the capital city of Kigali, and there are no survivors. Within an hour of the plane crash, a presidential guard, members of the Rwandan armed forces, and Hutu militia groups, they start setting up these roadblocks and barricades all throughout the city, in which they start to stop, pull over, and check the identity cards of Rwandan citizens. Just to kind of get a vision for how this starts to really launch and take place, I was kind of rewatching scenes from the movie Hotel Rwanda, and there's a scene where they check the main character's passport, and stamped on his identification card is his ethnic identity, Hutu and Tutsi. And so this ethnic identity is put in the official government documents. And so when you have these militia groups, searching people and trying to figure out their identities, right, these government set identities really are the downfall for a lot of innocent people here. So as the violence starts to ramp up, and as these militia groups start to take control, these Hutu nationalist groups start to take control. One of the first victims of the genocide is Hutu Prime Minister Agathe Uwilingiyimana. I'm sorry for butchering that. Uwilingiyimana. And 10 Belgian peacekeepers killed on April 7th. And so now, in about a span of 24 hours, you have the president who was killed and also the prime minister. And so the two heads of government are both dead within 24 hours. And inside that political vacuum and in a culture of violence, extremist Hutus take control of the government by April 9th. Because of this, because of the death of the Belgian peacekeepers, Belgium removes any sort of peacekeeping presence in Rwanda, making more and more room for the extremists to carry out violence and genocide. So, from the city, the mass killings in Kigali quickly spread from the city to the rest of Rwanda. There is, for a short period of time, for the first 14 days, some resistance from regional Tutsi officials. However, they are eventually either removed from office, silenced, or, of course, killed by Hutu extremists. And once they are removed from these regional, kind of agricultural offices, rural offices, there's really no way to stop the spread of violence. Some government officials, faced with the rising tide of violence, stop trying to stop the violence and then join in the violence that starts to sweep over the nation. Over government media, okay, that is now taken over by Hutu extremists, that government-sponsored media starts openly calling for ordinary citizens to also take up arms and to join the violence and to start killing their Tutsi neighbors and countrymen. As that violence spreads across the country, we do see this happen, where lots of common people take up arms and murder their fellow countrymen. In a span of about 3 months, 800,000 people are killed. The Rwandan Patriotic Front, okay, made up of Tutsis, seeing that the genocide is being inflicted upon the Tutsis, resume fighting, and there's a civil war that breaks out alongside the genocide. By July, the Rwandan Patriotic Front regains control of most of the country. Along with the 800,000 dead, there are 2 million refugees spread out through the Congo. The Rwandan Patriotic Front establishes a joint government with a Hutu president and Tutsi vice president, which was the initial aim of the previous ruling president, to create a government in which both ethnic minorities are represented. Uh, Haba Aramana's NRMD party, right, even though he was killed, it is largely his party and the Hutu nationalists within it who undertake the genocide. That party is abolished, and a new constitution is written which eliminates that reference to ethnicity in 2003. That new constitution also brings about Rwanda's first ever legislative elections. One thing, let me just check, get two more. One thing about the Rwandan genocide and its place within the international community is that, right, the United Nations exists, and we also have this period where mass media exists, modern media exists, CNN, cable news networks, 24-hour/7 news does exist, and you get these scenes in the early 1900s as the Rwandan genocide is going on and it is in the news cycle over and over and over again, and the international community largely knows about the atrocities that are happening in Rwanda. Uh, Parallel to that, you have a slow and sluggish and disquieting response from the United Nations. So, for the vast majority of the time that this genocide takes place, the United Nations Security Council initially withdraws most of the peacekeeping forces, which again makes room for the genocide to take place. As the genocide raged, there is that slow and sluggish political process in the United Nations, which eventually is able to approve 5,000 troops to enter Rwanda to end the genocide. However, by the time those troops are available, the genocide is over. There is a separate French intervention uh, that takes and enters a small part of Rwanda that sets up a quote unquote humanitarian zone. Right? It is not a full scale intervention. They essentially set up a small boundary where people can be protected if they make it, but the Rwandan genocide continues despite this small effort. In 1996, after the genocide, the United Nations, in a small part, trying to make up for their lack of a response to end the genocide sooner and to save, however many hundred thousands of lives, does set up one of the largest humanitarian relief efforts in history. Afterwards, October 1994, you get the first international tribunal since the end of World War II and the Nuremberg trials. This was also the first international tribunal with the mandate to persecute genocide as a crime. That trial and that commission, that tribunal lasted for a decade and a half. It was dissolved in 2015.